Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Vance, and I'm here today with Jules Edwards. You were originally supposed to be with Cheyenne Thornton, but in this pandemic era, things came up and she needed to step away. Cheyenne is the incumbent chair of the Board of Neuroclastic, a nonprofit organization led by autistics, mostly a publication, and I'm the CEO of that org. And I'll let Jules introduce herself in just a second. Quick note from the conference organizers: the closed caption service had an emergency and had to cancel. So there is not live captions today. There are auto captions, and unfortunately, because of this last minute change, they cannot be turned off. But yes, so you have sign language available and there are auto captions. As we speak and present today, if you want to leave us questions in the chat, then we will get to them as soon as we can. And we have 2 planned spaces to stop and answer questions as well. So we'll do our best to get to everyone. And welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. Jules?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am Jules Edwards. I write for Autistic Typing. I am a disabled parent of 3 disabled children. We're all autistic, among other things. I'm a disability justice advocate. I do formal and informal work to support disabled individuals and our families. I do a lot of volunteer work in the community, as well as online activism and writing and things like that. So that's me. Tara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Tara Vance. I'm the CEO and founder of Neuroclastic, and that is the organization that I was just talking about. We're a nonprofit org with over 500 autistic contributors who range from non-speaking teenagers up to seniors, autistic elders, and we're in 6 continents, and we are very diverse group of autistic own voice perspectives. And so if you want to learn more about autistics after this conference, feel free to check us out. I am an industrial and organizational psychology consultant, which just basically means the psychology of large groups and systems. And for 14 years, I was an English teacher, and then a short couple years as a trauma counselor. I'm autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and the reason that my camera is not on is I have selective mutism, and I can make eye contact with everyone except myself. So if I turn my camera on today, then I would not be able to remember what I'm supposed to say because I would be too distracted by my own self. So sorry about that, but that is an accommodation that I have to give myself so we can stay on topic. We're going to be talking today about letting autistic kids be kids, and you'll see Jules and I will just kind of take turns on this. We have different areas of passions, and so we'll just be splitting the airtime. If you have questions, just drop them in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Jules for a minute. You want to take over, Jules?
Sure. Thanks, Tara. So we're going to talk about what happens when an autistic child is diagnosed, and why do parents worry so much And after that, what is the best way to proceed? What do you do when your child has a new autism diagnosis? Um, so in my experience, and I've gone through this 3 times with my children, what happens when an autistic child is diagnosed? It can be so dramatically different for different children and different providers. Um, I had the experience of the diagnose and dump for 2 of my children. They were a little bit older. So they were diagnosed, and then we were told to have a nice life. So I had to take on a lot of the responsibility for researching what does it mean? What do we do by myself? And then for my youngest, when she was diagnosed, we were given the diagnostic assessment and recommended a lot of different therapies, and they didn't fit into what we wanted to do. So that was kind of tough. Why do parents worry so much? Parents worry so much because they love their children and they want what's best for their children. And it can be frightening, it can be intimidating to be given this diagnosis and you don't really know much about it or what to do. And then what is the best way to proceed? We're going to talk about that today.
So I also am a parent of an autistic child, and I have been through this. I only have one child, but what every parent with a child who's diagnosed as autistic is going to hear, it's just this refrain, this chorus of you need early intervention, intervention, intervention. And what exactly is that you're supposed to intervene on? No one tells you that. Just if you don't intervene, your child is going to never do all of these things, and it will be a horror story. But if you do intervene, then your child might one day be independent and have a great life and have friends and be able to speak. And so that kind of urgency, it can be super harmful. And so Jules and I are going to talk about, and this is going to be less formal than some of the other presentations, because this is more about the emotional support that you need and that parents need and children need. So yeah, these are things that does your 18-month-old not speak? They're going to be referred to intensive speech and behavior therapies. Do they toe walk or W sit? And toe walk means walking on the front ball of your foot, and W sit is you have a lot of autistic kids are super bendy, and they sit with their legs, like they sit flat on the floor with their legs out to the side, kind of making the shape of a W. And they're going to be referred to occupational and physical therapy if they have big emotions, which all young children have big emotions, or if they have sensory issues, they'll be referred to ABA and occupational therapy. But there's this frantic urgency to intervene. And why does that happen? Well, it always has been the thing that we do a lot of things that are not the most logical or helpful because that's what everyone is doing. That's not always the best route to take. Like the Victorian fainting couch, that was a necessity because it became popular furniture in the Victorian era because women wore these corsets with steel bones that were so tight to make them look thinner and more shapely that they would faint because they just couldn't breathe. Jules, you want to take over?
Sure. Some other ideas that society had was using pantyhose as the norm of the dress code. Schools and hospitals often had a smoking lounge, and teachers would smoke during class. We still have tanning salons in every strip mall. We have ubiquitous white male leadership in politics, business, and religious institutions.
So lots of bad ideas just become the norm or the gold standard. And this is not a real billboard. This is just something we put together. But if your child has emotions, that sound the alarms, call us before your child is ruined for life and has no future. And therapy pitch sounds like a commercial because it absolutely is a commercial, and a therapy is a product. So your first line of questioning to start asking is, are you being convinced that you need to enroll your child in all these therapies? Because if you don't, then there will be tragedy. If so, that's manipulative advertising, right? And we're going to talk about when you do need to know when to enroll your child in therapies later in this presentation. So we often ignore what's most effective because for the same reason that we had fainting couches and teachers' lounges had smoking lounges and hospitals had smoking lounges. We do things because that's what everyone is telling us we're supposed to do. Jules?
So autistic people do not have fewer neural resources. Those resources are just distributed differently. Science can move us to autistic development and supporting autistic children and adults.
Yes. And so we're going to talk about like the difference between neuroscience and what we're starting to understand. And you got a lot of clues about that in the previous post. What we're starting to understand about autistic children compared to what everyone is calling the evidence base of like, if you enroll your child in this intensive intervention, then you'll have these outcomes, and there's an evidence base that it can improve things for your child. But there is not an evidence base, or not a substantial one at all, about what the potential harms are for jumping into all these therapies. And so yeah, so do we have any questions from the audience so far? How do we help students with similar challenges in college when everything is now on Zoom? Oh, that's a good question. Jules, do you want to take that one?
So how do we help students with similar challenges in college when everything is now on Zoom? Do we mean like the video difficulty?
Yeah, I think that having cameras on and
Sure. I think that this is something that should go through the disability office. A lot of the time, disabled students get accommodations written into a support plan, which can be communicated to instructors or professors. And one of the cool things about that is that the letter that you get from the disability office doesn't necessarily have a specific diagnosis or violate your privacy. Usually it just says these are accommodations that, the school has agreed are helpful for this person. You could also, pre-record a video to share as your background or as your photo or image on the Zoom. But really having that open communication with your teachers would be the best.
Yes, and I'll just add to that it's a mixed bag when you communicate with professors. We at Neuroclassic get a lot of college students who are having a lot of difficulty with the Zoom classes. And one reason is that a lot of us are lip readers and have severe auditory processing deficits. And so when people are on Zoom and they're wearing a mask, it's very hard. It's already hard for us if we have auditory processing disorder to keep up with people speaking in real time and without captions, which a lot of times people do not enable those. Even the auto captions, they're not always perfect, but it helps a lot. We just have a really hard time keeping up, and if we can't read lips, we might not be able to understand at all what people are saying, and that can happen in real time. I had a professor, I had to change majors because there was a course that was required, but only one professor taught it, and I could not understand a word he said ever. At the end of class, I had no idea what anything he said was because he mostly faced the board and he did not have any tone or inflection. He was very monotone, and that makes it harder for me to understand what I'm hearing. And so you have to try to communicate with your professors, because a lot of times there are things that you can't predict for and get a doctor's note for about what's going to cause you a hard time. So that is another thing that you can do. And if you're not able to do that, then a lot of times you can contact local disability orgs and see if they can write you a letter, get your doctor to write you a letter, check in with your universities, different student support services, like Jules said. So the next question is, I have the impression that many autistic people also experience trauma. How can they best be supported in their development and well-being? I think that we're going to talk a lot about that in this presentation, but Jules, did you have anything that you wanted to specifically add to that?
I do. I would say the first thing to do is to try to prevent trauma by providing support that meets a person's needs. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that today, but the best intervention is prevention of trauma.
Yes, I totally co-sign that. So I'm going to talk a little bit right now. I'm going to get into some sciencey stuff, not too sciencey, so don't worry. And then after that, I'll hand over to Jules, and she'll be talking more about the lived experience and providing those supports. So And you learned a little bit about this with Aaron. Autistic kids, we know they are, quote, wired differently. That's something everyone knows about autistic kids and adults, but we're talking about children today. They have a different developmental trajectory, not just from non-autistic kids, but from other autistic kids too. So we have all of these normative developmental timelines, and we can almost to the day predict when non-autistic kids are going to start developing certain skills. And there, can be a lot of reasons that a non-autistic child doesn't develop the skills that their peers do on the same timeline. But an autistic child may develop a skill 6 months later or earlier, or a year later, or 5 years later, because they all have a different developmental trajectory. So when you develop skills is based on your brain's blueprint for your future adult self. And by the age of 6, you're 95% developed. Your brain is 95% developed. Almost all of that is, I think it's 80% before the age of 2. So that's, 3. So that's a very critical developmental period in those first 6 years, especially the first 3, that you see the pressure for early interventions becomes more and more every year when we talk about autism and earlier diagnosis. So now they want to figure out ways to start diagnosing autistic kids as infants, so that they can get them in these interventions. And we say, we don't want to make autistic kids more, quote, normal. We just want to give them the best life. But what you're doing is intervening on the blueprint of their future self. So if you imagine, most brains are like a row of row houses, right? You've got your similar layout, and your roof, your shingles might be a different color, your front door might be a different color. You might have different but tasteful ornamental shrubs and plants in your front yard, different colors, but they're super similar, and you can look at them and see they're all the same. None of them upset your homeowners association. But autistic brains are super different from each other and from non-autistics. So you might have an autistic brain that's like a yurt, or an RV. Is this RV still a home? Is it broken because it has wheels? Does it have the same features and functions as a row house? Yes, some of them, and no, some not. Is this still a home? Well, for people who live in one of these, that is their home. It is not a broken row house. It's an RV. Some autistic, this would be my brain, this expansive warehouse. And it takes me a very long time to go and find and retrieve my memories. But I'm that autistic person with the extreme memory. But it takes me a very long time to get to it. So I have to go and find my boxes by kind of manually walking through my brain. So it takes me a long time sometimes to process things before I can answer questions, because I have to go around my internal warehouse and get all that information manually. It doesn't happen automatically for me. It's a conscious process. It was actually just last year that I learned that not everyone does that. Not everyone has to imagine walking around their brain and like going into file cabinets and boxes to get things, which was hilarious to me at the time. There are so many things that I didn't know about or learn until the last year or two, talking to other autistic and non-autistic people, like, wait, doesn't everybody do that? Just, you don't know until someone tells you. No, everybody does not do that. I had no idea that most people didn't see color when they hear music, until a psychologist told me that that was a delusion or a psychiatric disorder, and tried to medicate me for it before I was diagnosed as autistic. You just don't know until you get there. And lastly, this is my daughter. Some autistic kids might be like a water park made of bounce castles with no seating. Would this impress your homeowners association? So I'm going to turn it over to Jules right now to talk about this a little bit.
Thanks. I just want to say that I really love this HOA, the Homeowners Association analogy, because neuronormative demands and expectations, which is neuronormative means the idea of people behaving as if they're neurotypical and communicating as if they're neurotypical. The idea of neuronormative behavior and interaction is so similar to the oppression that people experience from HOAs. It's this able white supremacy base of, this is what everyone should be, everyone should match, everyone should develop the same way. And that's just not possible. And it's not a good goal to have, because one of the best parts of neurodiversity is the diversity, is that we have so many different people from different backgrounds with different brain types, with different strengths and different spiky skill profiles, which is somebody may excel in one area independently, and they may need a lot of support in another area to be successful, or they may not be able to do something at all. And that's okay. And that's something to be celebrated.
And I put this specific slide in because this is my daughter here. I tried to think of if I could take her brain and her personality that's a result of her brain and put it into what kind of physical space would that be if most people are at home. And this is her. She is so energetic and so whimsical, and she loves to move and never stops. So there's no need for a seat anywhere. And so what would I have to do to make her fit into that homeowners association standards? First thing I would have to do is deflate her, right? I have one child. She has one brain and one future. And I'm not willing to do that. I have graduate education in psychology, but that did not prepare me at all to understand autism, even in myself. I was a teacher of largely autistic kids and taught special education classes for 14 years. That did not prepare me to understand autism. I married an autistic man. That prepared me a little bit, but it wasn't until another autistic adult, a local friend, told me, you need to learn about autism from autistic people. After I had all that experience and all that education and all that real time working with autistic kids or teens, mostly adolescents, that I actually began to really understand autism. And so I had to make that decision, because there's all that pressure, and you almost feel like as a parent, if you don't do it, you're being accused of like social services level negligence for not enrolling your child. They really will shame you, like you have ruined your child's future and you're neglecting them. They try to put my child in 4 different therapies. At first, because she was late speaking and so energetic, they said that she was severely intellectually disabled. Then she started speaking, and they said, oh, she's gifted and hyperlexic, which is uh, when a child much earlier than most children, usually, for my daughter, I think she was reading before she spoke. So she started the beginning of being able to read before she even hit 2. And now at age 5, she fluently reads, but she was fluently reading, before she hit age 3. So, to deflate my daughter, to tone her colors down with these interventions, what kind of impact is that going to have? Because by definition, an intervention is really an intervention on your neurology. So, and that's not to say that you should never do an intervention. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But quickly, let's see if we have a question or two to kind of give you a brain break. And if anybody needs to step away, these are all recorded. Feel free to get up and walk around and do what you need to do. Jules, do you see any questions in the chat?
I do, and I'm very excited about the first one. Question number 1 is there evidence that AAC, that's augmentative and alternative communication for people who aren't familiar with that, is there evidence that AAC works as an early intervention? I'm curious about getting younger children access to communication devices to help make their needs known. There is a lot of evidence to show that AAC works, and it's an appropriate intervention, so to speak. I wouldn't even say it's an intervention. I would say that it is accessible communication is a human right, period. Everyone has the right to communicate. Everyone should have whatever form of communication will help them live happy, good lives. And there's not as much research about this as I would like to see. I would love to see the impact of language deprivation on autistic children specifically. There's some research about this topic as it relates to deaf children and the long-term outcomes. And the long-term outcomes of language deprivation in the deaf community have been described as a lot of things that parents have described as problems for their own children, such as violent outbursts and emotional difficulties and some other things. So the sooner that we can get accessible communication into the hands of people who need them, the better. And I'm not just talking about, the PECS cards or something. Children should have access to AAC immediately upon diagnosis. As soon as they show a need for communication support, they should have it.
Yes, and I just want to promote at 2:45 Eastern time today, there is another session that's going to be all about AAC with Maisie, T, and Tiffany. You can read about that and in the program, and be sure to tune in for that, especially if you're looking into more information about AAC. It'll be amazing. So another question is, I'll read it. what are some of the alarm bells that may not be so easily identified at first glance? So I think by this question, what you mean is what are some of the signs that a child may be autistic? At birth, you might notice some differences in facial asymmetry. So I, I can't explain how I knew this. I knew that the instant my daughter was born that she was autistic because of a feature, the swirl in the crown of her hair was extremely dramatic. And somehow that just let me know that my child was autistic. She also has the most adorable ears. One is shaped like my husband's ears, and one shaped like my ear, um, which is, just a thing that's asymmetrical. Once we noticed that she was left-handed, left-handedness is highly correlated with being autistic. Not every lefty is autistic, but that's just a correlation. Um, she did a lot of things a lot earlier than most children, like smiling and laughing. She was laughing, like robust, hard belly laughing at like 2 months, when I don't think kids are smiling purposefully that early. But she started smiling before she was a month old, purposefully at people. But then there were other things, you can look for emotional differences. My daughter didn't sleep more than 4 hours a day for the first 6 months of her life, and never more than 20 minutes at a time. She didn't seem to need it. She was just always hyper. She did not shed a tear until she was like 8 months old. Happiest kid, but not calm. Super communicative with her grunts and baby noises, that she wanted to have fun all the time. So we had to swing her around like the airplane position, when you have a baby in your hands on their stomach and you're flying them around. She never wanted to be still. So that was, some of our indicators. But you can notice sensory differences, and tolerance to noise and things like that. I wouldn't call any of that alarm bells, though. Just differences that I would never call possibly autistic as a red flag or being alarmed. Just a thing to notice that your child might be autistic. Jules, do you want to take the next one?
Sure, thank you. Oh, this one is kind of a long one. I always said that besides not speaking on the social timeline, we did not have any idea that our daughter was autistic. Birth to 3 pushed us to start pre-K at 3. I always said that it was not until my daughter was in pre-K that she started showing autistic behaviors. Now I'm wondering if her backwards progress and behaviors were because we pushed too much too soon. My daughter was not medically diagnosed until she was 4.5. So if we don't do the early intervention like push to do, what do we do? I think that there's some content in this presentation coming up that's going to talk about this, this kind of like dance of learning new skills and something that is identified as regression. I don't really love that word, but I think a lot of people know what that word means. So we'll talk about that coming up.
Yeah, I think we have a lot in here.
Maybe we can move on. And
yeah, let's move on since we're going to answer this question anyway. So meeting milestones, that's kind of in the vein of that question. So if we realize that our children are autistic because they're, quote, missing milestones, that is because we're looking at the standard of development, right? The development of a neurotypical brain. That's not your child's brain. Your child is an RV or a yurt and not a row house. And that's okay. You don't have a manual for your child if they're autistic. because even if there was an even amount of research into autistic development as there was in neurotypical child development, which is what they just call the default or the standard of development, it wouldn't be possible because all autistic people are different. So some people are extremely advanced in some areas and have deficits in others, where like with my daughter and her reading, she was reading before she was 2. I couldn't read until 5th grade. So that's a big difference. Love of words is like, and reading is now my favorite thing. It's what I do all the time in writing. But I just, late bloomer, came later than most people. And that was largely it was almost exclusively due to having mirror image dyslexia, or seeing things backwards to what most people saw. But even more than that, eye tracking and visual dyspraxia or apraxia. Ocular apraxia is when your eyes do not move with the intentionality you would need them to follow from line to line. And what I needed was large print. And I actually did very well on standardized tests, and didn't realize until I was an adult that it was because those standardized tests only had 2 questions per page when I was in elementary school. And this was I was born in 1980. So this was, early and mid 80s. But I did better on those tests, but they only had 2 questions and they were huge font, like maybe 16, 20, 24. I can't remember that well. But this is huge. All kids have developmental leaps. You can download parenting apps that show you when a child is expected to have a leap, what happens during those leaps, and at the end of the leap, what skill you can expect them to come out of the leap having developed. And largely, these are extremely accurate for non-autistic kids, and sometimes for autistic kids. In my informal research, and that just means asking a ton of autistic parents with autistic kids about developmental leaps, it seems like most autistic kids hit the leaps at about the same time as non-autistic kids, but the skills that they gained or lost during those leaps were different. So during a leap, your brain is rearranging at like the speed of light. It's undergoing radical changes, tens of thousands of new neural connections every second. Now, we know that autistic people's brains have far more synapses, neural connections than, or the, let me not get deep into neuroscience because then we'll just be on here for 3 days. We know that autistic kids have different brains. We know that they prune or lose connections less. So they hold a lot more in their brains than other kids. And we can imagine that these leaps for these different brains can be extremely dysregulating for autistic kids. Leaps are normal. Kids lose their sleep. Parents think, what in the world happened to my child? They were so calm and so sweet and loving, and suddenly now they're angry and they're doing this thing and they're biting me. That's all children. It's normal for kids to go through these leaps. They might wake up 20 times in the night when they used to sleep at night. And they can go for a couple weeks, up to 6 weeks, I think, is some of the longest developmental leaps. But we don't know what happens when autistic children go through these leaps. We just know that it's normal for all kids to go through leaps. we know what to expect with typically developing children, but not so much with autistic children. So when we think of a lagging skill, we're thinking about based on these developmental leaps for non-autistic kids. And let's talk about my daughter a little bit. She at 5 still is not good at nodding her head. Just doesn't have the motor coordination for that. It's fine. I'm not worried about it. She's not yet able to dress herself. That's fine too. I'm sure by the time that she's an adult, she'll be able to. And if not, we'll work on that when we get there. She can't drink with a straw, but I'm 41 and I can't, without a straw. I'm 41 and I can't either. I just use straws. That was a thing that someone said, a developmental pediatrician said that we should work on in therapy. And we could, and she could spill things on herself, and that's very distressing for her. Late toileting is super common with autistic people for lots of neurological reasons. A lot of them have hypermobility, or they're really stretchy tissues, and so their bladders might overfill because of that stretchiness of their tissues. That's normal because autistic people have, like I said, hypermobility and connective tissue differences and disorders sometimes. And they may not be able to feel that they have to pee or use the restroom until it's an emergency or at all. So it's very normal for autistic children to toilet late. We have quite a few professionals in our collective at Neuroclastic who are adults who have to wear disposable underwear, adult diapers every day. They wear them to work. They have spouses. It's not a big deal. It's just like putting on a pair of underwear, but you throw them away if you have an accident. So it's not that big of a deal, but we panic over it. And so you're having your child disrobe with a stranger who forcibly holds them down on a toilet to toilet train them. And that's a big deal. That doesn't happen to most children. That's very intrusive. We know as autistic adults, many autistic adults experience sexual abuse and assault. They have high levels of social susceptibility, so they get in trouble a lot because they've just learned that they have to say yes to everyone who violates their bodily autonomy. My daughter was reading at age 2, right? And she still has these things that a lot of kids who are 2, she's still working on them. And that's fine. I'm not worried about it at all. We work on things like every parent and child at home in our normal everyday life. And when we don't stress or worry about them. And I think that it would be extremely cruel if, because my daughter was reading at age 2, we made every other child do intensive early reading therapy at age 2. We know they're not developmentally ready for that. Their brains are not ready for that. My child's brain was, because she developed that skill very early. Hyperlexic kids tend to kind of even out. They start out, in kindergarten, they really impress teachers. But then within a couple years, they have usually just evened out and they're reading about the same level as their peers, and that's fine because different developmental timeline. But wouldn't it be cruel if we sent 2-year-olds to reading boot camp, intensive reading boot camp, and said they're never going to read if we don't get them in this boot camp? Would it interfere with their regular development? Absolutely. They're not supposed to be trying to read at age 2 for most kids. So when you have an autistic child, there's a whole lot of taking their lead, watching them, seeing what they're super interested and focused on. And just like you would with any child, facilitating and fostering and nurturing those skills that they're developing at that time. And it's scary because you think, am I doing the wrong thing? Are we going to regret this later? I can tell you that I am not in any way regretting the decisions that I've made about not enrolling in all of these therapies. But I'm going to turn it over to Jules right now. That was my big long stretch. Now it's Jules' turn. Are you there, Jules? Oh, she's messaged she's having trouble with Zoom. So we'll let her try and figure that out. And sorry, you're stuck with me for a minute. And we have some more questions from the audience. If you want to send those to me, Kira, while we wait for Jules to get reconnected. Tara, asking as a therapist, did you have positive or negative personal experiences with therapy? Much of what you're saying feels like therapy is discouraged. My son is autistic. I do not agree or subscribe to ABA and do my best to listen to and follow the advice of the autistic community. I do, however, support early intervention, OTPT, and speech. What makes you agree or disagree with that? That's actually what's coming up next. And while we wait for Jules, Jules, just interrupt me when you get in because I can't see you. Some screen sharing. So, oh, you're there. Good.
Sorry.
You're okay.
What happened, but Zoom updated recently and it occasionally does that. So
yeah, I get stuck too sometimes. So we're definitely not saying not to do therapies. And we have coming up, how to kind of decide when to enroll your child in therapy. And one thing you got to think about is, are they lagging or not there yet? If you're focusing on skills your child is not ready to develop, you are at the same time devaluing the skills that they're supposed to be developing at that moment. You're deprioritizing what their brain is saying. We're supposed to be doing this right now because you think you're building a row house, but you're really building a yurt or an RV. And so you're feeling all this distress because the blueprint doesn't look like what you are told that it's supposed to look like for a row house. But that's not what your child is, and according to this analogy. And there's a high risk of trauma. Someone asked earlier about trauma, and we talk about avoiding trauma. So you have all these messages when you're autistic from society, every day, all day, all these missed signals where the autistic person is trying to communicate, trying to understand, but society is like, be yourself, but not like that. Quiet hands, don't do that in public, that's weird, sit still. Why did you say it like that? And they believe that we mean more than we do mean because we're so literal. They think we're implying things. So autistic people get all these messages every day, every social interaction. There are all these messages of where we're not connecting. And sometimes an intervention therapy can increase the speed of it. It's doing that exponentially faster. That whole you're off. You need to do it differently. You're not right. There's not enough curiosity about the child and who that child is and what they can do, because there's so much urgency in what they can't do. So we're not saying not to do therapies. We're saying to be critically thinking about what therapies are important. And I'll turn over to Jules now that her mic is back to working.
Thanks, Tara. So we have a question, and it was directed to you, but I really would like to answer it as well. And it says, did you have positive or negative personal experiences with therapy? Much of what you are saying feels like therapy is discouraged. My son is autistic. I do not agree or subscribe to ABA and do my best to listen to and follow the advice of the autistic community. I do, however, support early intervention, OT, PT, and speech. What makes you agree or disagree with that? And in my perspective, when I'm evaluating whether a therapy is something that I'm interested in pursuing for my children, is does it increase safety and does it improve quality of life, versus is this therapy meant to make my child more convenient for others? And that for me is the distinguishing question as to whether it's something that I'm interested in pursuing. So we're going to talk about this here, the therapeutic necessity or no. If a child is frequently choking on foods, drinks, or even their own saliva, then they need speech and language therapy or an ENT or a GI doctor. If a child is experiencing extreme distress from sensory issues, they need an occupational therapist specialized in sensory. And I also know families whose children, they don't eat, or they have like an extremely limited diet, or something called ARFID. Oh gosh, I can't remember what it stands for. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. I think that's what it stands for. But there are definitely conditions that require treatment and therapy. But it's really based on, is it improving quality of life? Is it promoting safety, versus is my child learning to mask or become more convenient for the people around them?
And so what Jules just said, you can kind of take those heuristics, those questions, and look at them when you're beginning the therapy process or deciding if you need it or not. If your child is miserable all the time and they're in distress, yes, you definitely need to seek some kind of help. You don't want your child's most formative years to be full of trauma, because that is the most important thing. You do not want your child's entire existence to be marked by early developmental trauma. So you don't want to cause it by putting them in therapies that repeatedly distress them to, quote, build tolerance. We know from neuroscience that autistic people do not habituate in the same way to sensory stimuli that non-autistic people do. So you might be exposing your child to loud noises and causing them extreme pain and sensory dysregulation all the time, trying to get them, quote, used to it so they tolerate it more. But you're really just teaching them to shut down and stop crying. Like if a newborn baby or a very young infant doesn't get parental attention when they cry, they stop crying. They fail to thrive. They stop growing. It will have lifelong consequences on them. You don't want to do that to your autistic child ever. You don't want to put them in that failure to thrive mode where they've learned that they have no recourse to getting their needs met, so they just stop trying. So when your therapist, when your child's therapy providers are doing things to help you support your child, that's when it's good. When they're doing things that you can see they're trying to help them build tolerance or to just accept it more. A lot of times, especially for children who are non-speaking, before they've um, been able to get fluent with AAC, then their behaviors that you might look at as extreme, that's the only way that they have to communicate, and you don't want to stop that, because then what if they have medical issues later and they've just learned, and this happens to me as an adult still. I don't know what the acceptable threshold of suffering is uh, before I need medical attention. And I've almost died, like multiple organ failure and sepsis, and shown up at work that way with jaundice because I had untreated infection that just kept getting worse because I don't know when I suffer a lot because I have to put up with a lot of things in a world that's not accommodating for me and my needs. And so I don't know when I need help. You don't want, and I tell everybody, I don't want my child to be me in the future. So I raise my child to not be this. You might look at me and think, well, you have a degree and you have a spouse and you are doing presentations, you're doing great. I have suffered so much. I can't believe I'm still alive. And so this is what autistic adults are telling you. A lot of my friends are not, have not made it. The average lifespan for us is 38. A lot of my longest term friends are not here anymore. I'm 41, so I've outlived autistic life expectancy, and we need to take that very seriously as early as we can, and supporting our kids. Like Jules was talking about with ARFID, if you're pushing your super picky, I don't like the word picky, but that's what people always call it, particular child who only eats a few foods, if you're trying to force feed them, that's going to cause trauma, and it might make them worse, not help them expand their diet. Not speaking by the age of 3 or earlier than that, start exploring AAC. A lot of times kids are denied AAC and they'll try to force the children to speak to get their needs met, or they'll take AAC away like a punishment. That's not okay. So you can get rid of them. Jules?
Thanks. Another super important skill that needs to be taught to all autistic children is how to be safe around water and swimming lessons. And the reason for this is because it is an important survival skill. Autistic children are 160 times more likely to drown than able children. And 32% of parents of autistic children report a close call with drowning. And we don't have enough data around this to make a whole lot of conclusions, but I can kind of speculate a little bit about the increased risk for non-speaking children and children who elope. So we know that about 49% of autistic children over the age of 4 attempt to elope. And eloping is when a child or adult, I guess, may be wandering off, or they may be running, and there, are unlimited reasons why this may occur. It could be trying to avoid something, or, just trying to explore. But about 1/3 of autistic children who elope are non-speaking children. And we really need to ensure that autistic children have the skills to stay alive. So this is one intervention that I actually support for every single autistic child, is this water safety and swimming, as well as, and again, I don't perceive it to be an intervention, but rather a support of having access to AAC or whatever kind of accessible communication that the child needs. I know in my family, when my eldest children were younger, I had no idea about anything about autism or how to support them, but we used single, sometimes 2 words together, and we used baby sign language to communicate. So we did what we had to do. But now it's easier to find information about AAC. So that's something that I support very strongly.
Okay, and we only have 4 minutes left, so we'll try to wrap up and maybe take 1 or 2 questions before we sign off. What is it that autistic kids need the most? And this can help you. Again, please don't think that we're saying not to do therapies. We're saying not to buy into the hype that you need to enroll your kid in a ton of therapies just because they're not meeting skills at the same time as other kids who are not autistic. The first thing they need is support. This world is not made for your child. It's made for the neuronormative child. So you're going to have to fight a lot your child's entire life and teach them how to fight for themselves, to self-advocate in schools, everywhere, so that people understand that your child is different and that's okay. But we don't expect them to meet the same standards without the right supports. And I would say maybe even more so to be seen and known. This is huge. I think that a lot of autistic adults still do not feel seen by anyone in their immediate family or understood and deeply known, because we focus so much on those, quote, lagging skills and things that are different and trying to make sure that they don't have a terrible future, that we ruin their present. You don't want to do that. I have never heard a parent say, I wish that we had done a lot more therapies and that we had tried a lot harder to change our child. I've never heard anyone say that, but I hear parents all the time saying, I wish I didn't worry so much. I wish I didn't spend my child's first, chunk of life just constantly distressed about everything that was different and trying to, quote, fix it. So take the time to get to know and see your child, understand their behaviors, interact with them the way that they are trying to interact with you. You don't need to parent them the way that you would parent non-autistic children. You need to parent them the way that they need. And you don't know what that is. So it takes time. Connect with the autistic community. Autistic adults remember being autistic children, and they can help you very much. They help me so much. I'm so grateful because I wouldn't have known to do things the way that I did without having the privilege to interact with and get to know myself and my child with the help and guidance of the autistic community. So they need healthy, secure attachments to the people in their lives so that they can be the person that they're wired to be. And you don't know what that's going to be yet, and that you need to be okay with that and just be excited to find out once you change your mind to being okay with not knowing how the future is going to be, but knowing that they'll know that they were loved and supported and understood and heard and seen, the future will be better for them. Jules, you want to take a last question before we close?
Sure. Okay. One question: I work in early intervention. Doctors almost always recommend ABA therapies and say that is the answer. How do I talk to families of newly diagnosed autistic children about why not to go ABA when doctors are telling them they should? That's a really good question.
We get this a lot.
Yeah, we do get it a lot. I think the way to talk to families is really helping them reframe this idea of what autism is and what it means, and reminding them autism is not an emergency. It's a disability that will be there for a child's entire life, and that is just, something that we need to accept. There's this idea that called radical acceptance, and it means that something isn't good or bad, it just is. And that's something that we really need to embrace with the idea of autism. Autism is just part of who your kid is, and it's not that big of a deal. I mean, I'm sorry, it is kind of a big deal, but it's not an emergency. So help them find solutions to actual problems that they're facing, because autism itself is not the problem. It's all of the other stuff. It's the risk of drowning. It's the risk of eloping. It's the lack of accessible communication. It's the lack of sensory accommodations. Those are the problems. So when we focus on what the actual problems are and resolve the actual problems, we can support our child's emotional development, make them feel safe and secured with their parents and other caregivers. But if they're not feeling safe with their caregivers, it's going to be more difficult.
I second all of that. There are a lot of articles and resources that question and some of the other ones that we didn't have time to get to because we're out of time. But I have resources and links, and I'll talk to the organizers about putting some further reading and more information to answer some of the questions that you've asked. You have our emails, Jules and my email on the screen. Thank you so much for your great questions and for coming to this conference and learning from autistic people. I think a lot of the questions that have been asked will be answered in future presentations that are planned for this conference. So again, thank you all for valuing autistic voices, and Jules will be on next, and you will hear from me again tomorrow. Thank you so much.